this work that we're talking about is not just about working with people with disabilities, right? It's really not just about that it's really a way of thinking about our lives and can really help to help us to shape relationships in ways that I think just help us and those around us have better lives. So, but this idea that we think about what are the things that we're looking for, or we as human beings are looking for in our lives, and then the 5 accomplishments are really focusing on what can the system do, or what outcomes are they looking for, and how can they make those outcomes possible for people? What do they need to focus on? So when they were talking about that, the 5 valued experiences are the things that we are all looking for in our lives. And those are actually on the ends of those yellow arrows, right? This idea that belonging is really important to all of us. And when we don't belong, we start to feel at loose ends. And I think COVID has really illustrated that for all of us, right? That this sense of belonging actually comes with connection. And in some ways it comes from being able to share ordinary places, right? That we don't get to do that as much as we used to. And it's really had an impact on us, right? But we also want to be respected. We want to make a contribution. I believe that all of you talked about that's part of what you're drawn to the work for, is to make a contribution to somebody else's life, to make a contribution to the community that you live in. And that I love that John says, like, we never get too good at choosing, right? Because sometimes we just make bad choices, and we need people to support us when we go to make choices. And there actually is another really great video by them that talks about this idea of choice and how the service system has circumvented this idea of choice as a default position to not do better, right? The person's decided that they want to sit in front of the television all day, so that's their choice, so that's what we're doing, as opposed to looking at this idea that we haven't done a very good job of giving people other options to choose, or other experiences that might allow them to make different choices. We were just meeting with somebody that Jen's supporting yesterday, who used to be pretty engaged in his life and really isn't right now, and he can't even make any kinds of choices. It's really where he's at presently in his mental state and his mental health, but the reality is that he used to make some really, really great choices and had a really good life, and it doesn't look the same, and he's struggling as a result of that, right? So this idea that those 5 valued experiences are at the core of what we need to be doing for ourselves or for the people around us, that we want them to have those experiences. These other arrows, the smaller yellow letters off the red star that is in that graphic, are actually the ways that we start to think about what are the outcomes that we're looking for a person if we're providing services and supports to them. And whatever that might be. It might even be unpaid supports, right? But we want people to have a sense of autonomy. And our sense of autonomy, we know, comes from this idea of being able to choose where and what and who we're with and what we do, and that there's a sense of belonging, right? That we are autonomous within a group, right? This idea of community participation. If we belong to groups and we're respected, then all of a sudden we're able to participate in the community. And so it goes around, all of those things. Valued social roles come from sharing ordinary places with people and being respected. Community presence. So when we're looking at what we're trying to do for people, what kind of outcomes we're looking for, community presence, right? I'm wanting them to have a presence in their community where they feel like they're actually making a contribution. So I would say, right, they want to be making a contribution. That's what I need to be looking for in the community for them. And that even as a basic starting point, just sharing some ordinary places, right? Going to the same coffee shop every time you show up, because that's where other people show up. When I first was in the middle of my divorce, both my wife and I were still sharing our house. We both worked from home. And I started going to the coffee shop because the home environment was just so incredibly oppressive. Not so much for me, but she was just so angry at that point in time. And so I started going to the coffee shop to get away from that and to get some work done. And as I showed up, all of a sudden there were people that I knew or got to know better in the coffee shop, because they all also showed up to get out of their houses because they were self-employed or whatever, and they were people that I knew or knew in general, but started to have those kinds of conversations with them. So this framework is one where we start to think about, what am I trying to achieve for the person, and what do I need that person to be looking towards to experience in order to have a good life. So these 5 valued experiences are really what make up a good life. Does that make sense? And so I always start to refer back to this as I start to think about that. Jen and I met with a couple of people yesterday, and I haven't had a chance to really look at this, but we already, even last night, were talking about where are the places where we know this one person could show up that is going to be tied into where his interests and probably some of his gifts are going to be able to be shared, right? So we start to think about that from the perspective of the person, and then try and plug in some of this stuff. Where can he make a contribution? Where is he going to be respected? Where is he going to be able to go where other people are going to be interested in what he's interested in, so that he can start to make connections as well? Cool. And we already know that might be an issue, right? That our job at the end of the day, if we're staying person-centered, is how do we support the family then to understand that a good life is one that where he gets to shape it. And he's in his 20s, right? Like, part of his whole modus operandi right now is to separate from his family, right? And he was very clear about that last night. Like, that's really what he wants, right? And so from a developmental perspective, I think as a professional, I think, well, this is pretty normal. How do I support a family who looks at him as somebody who's vulnerable, who needs more supports, and maybe they feel like he needs more than he actually does, right? And how do we actually negotiate that with the family and allow the person to take some risks and to experience some things that they might not be able to experience otherwise? So we're going to talk about the central purpose. This is really the basis of something of the work that I did in Michigan for about the last decade. It's built upon the work of Dr. John McGee and something called gentle teaching, where he originally had worked with street kids in Brazil and developed this idea of how to get connected to kids and how to be connected to people. And when he moved back to the US, people started to adopt it in ways particularly around supporting people who were particularly challenging. And we're going to talk about the 2 tenets of that. We're going to talk about the 4 pillars and the 5 tools, which were really the basis of his work. And the organization that I worked for was called the Macomocan Regional Center at that time, and they developed a program called the Center for Positive Living Supports, built on the work of McGee, and they'd been implementing that work in their supports coordination agency for about 2 decades. And the state government came to them and said, we're closing the last of the institutions, and we're trying to place some of the hardest, most difficult people into community, and we know people are going to need support. You've had plenty of success already. We want you to be the technical assistance and support for that. So we provided training for people. We provided in-house technical assistance where we would go in and spend some time with the person and their staff and try to help them hone where the deficits laid so that the person actually started to feel like they were connected and able to participate in their lives. And then we also provided some emergency supports if things were going really badly. But my friend Michael Vincent developed the central purpose, and it originally read, the central purpose of our presence in the lives of others is to nurture, teach, and sustain the experience of connectedness, companionship, and community. And about 2 years ago, he did a keynote outside of Amsterdam for the Gentle Teaching International Conference. And he'd been just retired. He'd been retired for a couple of years, and he was really thinking about the fact that John McGee, who had passed about 5 years previous, would have wanted the philosophy to evolve. And so he started looking at the central purpose, and he tweaked it. And he tweaked it in a way that I actually feel is actually more relevant as we think about the expansion of the work that we're doing. So it now reads, the central purpose of our presence in the lives of each other is to create, nurture, and sustain the experience of connectedness, companionship, and community. And I want to spend a few minutes kind of just breaking that down, right? It used to be our presence in the lives of others, but now he's shifted it to this idea that in the lives of each other really represents this idea that we too gain from our relationships with the people that we support. That we get to learn, we get to deepen our understanding of what it means to be human, we get to deepen our understanding of who we are and what's possible for us, and we get to understand ways in which we can interact and support people better and more deeply. So that shift from we're here in somebody's life to we are here together to learn together and to have good lives together, right? The obvious contribution that people make in our lives when we support them is like they financially support us, right? We make money in supporting them, but there is a host of other things that we continue to learn over time, right? So this idea that we want to create an experience, and what we're really trying to create is a connection and relationship with the person. And we need to bring in principles and ideas that are going to help us to create a space where people feel safe and supported. That's the initial part of the work that we do. Then, once that starts to happen, when we've created the container for that, we actually have to spend a lot of time nurturing the relationship. At the end of the day, it's really the only thing that we need to do. And it shows up in all kinds of ways in which we do it. Jen's introduction to each of you this morning was a way to nurture relationship, right? Here are the things that I think are amazing about you. I'm so grateful that you're here to do the work that we're doing together. You all bring something to that. I was just reflecting on the fact that we're all here together is probably something that isn't going to and doesn't happen an awful lot for the work that Jen's doing, because you're all over the place, right? But the value of that too, right? The four of you getting a chance to even have a conversation together about who you are and where you are in the world and what's going to happen in bringing together are all places where she's created a container and nurtured the relationship so that all of you can be nurtured and be supported as well. And then the idea is to sustain that over time. The problem with trying to sustain something over time is that there's an ebb and a flow to relationship, particularly because we all tend to go through things and we all have highs and lows. We all show up in different ways. We all bring our own baggage and family history and our own personal struggles to the work that we do. And so that's also true for the people we support. And so if we start to recognize those things, we can start to say, okay, things aren't quite right. It's not the same as it used to be. What's going on here? And the reality is, what we would say in the culture of gentleness is that we need to go back to nurturing the relationship. We don't need to fix the problem, because the problem will fix itself if people feel supported enough. So we're not here to fix problems, we're here to support people. And if we do that skillfully, we actually have an opportunity to deepen the relationship even more and have people looking at us in ways that are going to be supportive to them. Because at the end of the day, we want the experience for everybody to be a good one. We often talked about the four pillars as the foundation that held up the central purpose, right? That people need to feel safe and they need to feel loved in order for them to be loving back and to be engaged with us. And so if we think about this idea of safety, we know that pretty much we provide some pretty good, safe spaces for people to live in and to be in. This idea, though, of loved and valued is one that I think has gotten lost, right? So I'm not talking about amore. What I'm talking about is that people need to feel respected, valued, honored, and supported if we're thinking about love. Because that's what love brings all of us, right? And we can talk about loving our cars, our family, our house, a vacation home, football, Cheez-Its. Like, we can talk about loving all of those things, but we can't talk about loving the people we support. I think it's not that big a stretch, right? To think about it from that perspective. What we do know is that safety is critical, and safety has to be safe within the relationship between you and me, right? That we all have to feel safe with each other, and that we have to feel valued. And if that starts to show up, people start to trust us. So for me, that shift in becoming a supervisor at that group home meant that I got people who were first coming in to focus on relationship. I'm like, you don't have to do anything else. You might have to cook dinner because other people are going to be providing direct support, but I want you to focus on the relationship. I want you to focus on figuring out who this person is and how you can connect with them, right? And if you can get that sense of trust, then people are loving back to you, right? Again, using the example of my friend Esther, would often freak out, right? She had a behavior plan that was written that she She had to be escalated for about 30 minutes in order for her to get a PRN to calm down, and that PRN had to be authorized by a supervisor, so you actually had to make a phone call. And if you could get through that, and often she could on her own, if you just helped her through the process, is that then she was remorseful, right? Remorse showed up. I didn't really mean it, right? There's all sorts of reasons that behavior shows up, right? But at the end of the day, she'd be like, I'm really sorry. I'm like, that's loving back, right? Like this idea of the recognition that the relationship can help us get through. If and when that starts to happen, that's where we have an opportunity to be engaged with the person. That's where we have the opportunity to step in and do something together. But until people trust us, we don't have anything to work with. Does that make sense? All right, so I have a little worksheet in there that it's a series of questions about feeling safe and unsafe in a relationship. So if each of you could pull yours out, we're going to get you to fill that out. So John, there's another folder right there. You can grab yours there. But just take a minute and answer those questions, and then we'll do a little debrief after that.
Some DSP work with a client once a week. His name's Nicholas.
Nicholas. Okay.
I would say with my wife.
Mm-hmm.
Supporting an individual with challenging behavior.
So, give me a name. Or make up a name, I don't care.
Oh, make up a name
Yeah,
of the individual?
yeah, give me the name.
Pam.
Or Pam. We're never probably going to meet Pam. What about you, Jen? A relationship in your life where you felt safe?
My grandfather.
What did they do to make you feel safe?
For me?
Yeah, any of you. Could just be a shout out. What did they do?
So for that particular
Yeah.
person, how I know she feels safe around me and I feel safe is when I approach her, she smiles or use my hand to rub her hair. I know
Okay, what about other people?
Accepting.
They were accepting?
Helpful.
Helpful. Jen?
So he always had this way of making even a bad situation, like finding something good in me in the bad situation, by just the listening.
Cool. So what did that allow you to do? How did that allow you to be?
Vulnerable.
It allowed you to be vulnerable. That's a beautiful one. Oops. Vulnerable, free, reassured, confident, happy. Cool. All right. What about a relationship where you didn't feel safe?
Friend.
Just a friend, yeah? Yeah.
When I was young, in general.
Mm-hmm.
No one specific.
A lot of people.
Just in high school in general.
How do I want to put that down?
Childhood.
Yeah, but I want you to, so think about a relationship at that time that you didn't feel safe in. Like just even one.
All of them.
Like, so a friend, like a school classmate.
Just all of them.
I'm going to put classmate. I want to put something down. I gotta dig something out of there. What about you?
Co-worker.
A co-worker. What about you, Jen?
My mom.
I was going to say supervisor. All right. What did those people do to make you feel unsafe?
Asked me to lift a couch when I'm pregnant.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Oh,
My
no.
coworker, I'm like,
Sounds like
I'm
you're
pregnant.
insensitive.
Yeah,
They
he was
asked her
kind
to
of
lift the
cold.
couch?
I was like, what man asks a woman to lift the couch?
Okay, make me do something I can't.
Yeah.
What else?
Betrayal.
Ah, betrayal. Unpredictable.
Belittle.
Belittling. Just for the record, spelling doesn't count up here.
Selfish, maybe?
Oh, selfish. Vishaka, what did you say? Invalidating. All right. So what did that make you do? What did it make you do? How did you respond to that?
Defensive. Mistrusting.
Distrust. Defensive.
Careful, like, I don't know. Careful with what you
Cautious.
say.
Being cautious or careful, yep. Cautious. Careful.
Closed up.
Closed.
Distant? No.
Ooh, no, distance is good. See?
You're not reaching your fullest. I don't know how to explain that. It's just you're not putting
Unempowered.
No, you're not putting too much to kind of keep that relationship going or that connection going. You're just doing it on the surface. I don't know how to explain that.
Effortless?
Yeah, you don't want to put effort into that whole thing. You know, you're just trying to pull back or like.
I would almost say like disconnected.
Yeah.
I feel like you're disconnecting from the relationship to keep yourself feeling safe.
Disassociate. Yeah, maybe.
It's really an exercise. We don't have to.
You know what's really weird about this? Like, in my unsafe situation, a silver lining that came out of it was me knowing what my standards were and what I would and wouldn't tolerate. So it was something that was good that came out of that. Yeah, just knowing your worth and what your standards are, you know?
You learned about yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think often the other answer is that we realize how important this is. Right? Like we learn about ourselves, but we learn that safe relationships are places where we get to be engaged with people and able to be open, able to be participating. And when we're unsafe, people shut down, right? They isolate, they don't want to be connected to people, they move away from all of that.
I also doubt myself, I feel more. I feel like you doubt yourself more in an unsafe because you're not validating.
Mhm.
You're just not validating your experience or whatever it is that you're going through.
Right, you feel invalidated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, it's just whatever you're experiencing is kind of small. Like, it's just like, it's not even there or something, you know?
Yep. So I spend a little bit of time on this because we're going to talk about safe and valued a little bit later. But it just gives us a sense like what safety means, right, for us personally. And the one thing that we often said in the training I was doing regularly was that if it's true for me, it's true for the people I support, right? And to keep that lens on all the time. So the next thing we're going to talk about is something called, unless people have questions around any of this. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is the 5 tools, which is on the back of that, the same sheet of the pillars. Sorry, I was losing track of, and because I got distracted, because it actually says 4 tools, but it's 5. And the reason for that is originally McGee had it as the 4 tools. And for years and years of all of this training, the thing that often came up was like, why are there not ears? Like, why do we not think that we want our presence to be calm and reassuring? We want to make sure people are feeling safe with us. And sometimes that takes some effort on our part. But if we spend a little bit of time doing that, that we actually can be engaged with people better and we're going to be more successful. My friend Peter Marks in Canada now teaches something called conscious care and support that I'm now certified to train as well, around this idea that mindfulness is important. And that we often tell people, particularly when things get difficult, supporting people who are difficult, that we need to stay calm, right? And calm is really helpful, right? We actually know now that the science would say when people are escalating, we often get entrained with them. We start to escalate along with them. But if we can find a way to stay calm, that we can actually bring them back to calm. And so his point is that if you don't know what calm feels like, how do you find it in times of crisis? Right? But if you practice it, if you do some kind of mindfulness practice where you can understand and recognize what calm feels like, and then give yourself some cues and some triggers, you can actually pull yourself to calm in the moments of crisis, right? So this idea that our presence is number one in all of our relationships, right? And then thinking about these other things. If we think about our eyes, right? Our eyes communicate a lot. We actually have the most number of muscles in our body in our face, right? Our face and our eyes really dictate whether we're engaged with people, whether we're hearing them, right? And we can get distracted, right? Cell phones are one of the biggest distractions right now, and people know immediately. And that's not to say that you can't be in a relationship where it's okay. I think Jen and I are one of those relationships where we could be on our phone and talking and being engaged with each other because we know each other and we're both a little bit ADHD, so like it's all right for us to be able to do that. My friend Heather is another person who we often have our phone on the table, but we are also acknowledge that, like, can you just say that again? I was a little busy texting this one, right? Like, can you tell? Because I know that what you just said was important, right? But that we recognize the power that being engaged with somebody with our eyes fully makes a big difference. Ears, same thing, right? That little exercise we did at the beginning. How do we listen to people and how do we stay engaged with them? Our eyes become a part of that. Our presence becomes a part of that. And then our words become a part of that because we ask questions. We want to deepen the relationship. We want to understand a little bit more. We get curious about it. The thing about our words is also that it's not what we say sometimes, but how we say it, right? And recognizing that at the end of the day, I might think that I'm being the kindest, most loving person in the whole world, but if the person at the receiving end of what I'm saying doesn't hear that, then it's still bullshit. Right? It's still mean, it's still whatever they heard, right? And so we have an obligation to figure out what does it look like to support each other in the ways that we talk to each other. We want our words to be kind, we want them to be uplifting, we want them to be supportive, and we want to use them as much as possible in that way. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the tools and why utilizing them in this way is important when we talk about the 6 elements. The last one is hands or touch, right? Touch is critical to our relationships and to our being in the world. Touch is the fastest way to connect to people. And I'm honestly, if it wasn't the time of COVID, you probably all would have got a hug and a greeting from me, right? Like, it's just the nature of who I am. And to be able to feel free enough, that doesn't mean that I haven't done that and gone in for a hug. Have you ever gone in for a, well, you probably have gone in for a hug and people be like, you can feel them just like literally like, and you're like, oh shit. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Give John O'Brien a hug. He's just like too sensory, right? But then that's just, I mean, we're going to make some mistakes in all of this. That's also how we learn to be with each other, right? It's like, okay, no more hugs for that person, right? It looked like they were coming in for it, but apparently it wasn't comfortable for them. So let's just not do that anymore, right? And there'll be people who'll be like, oh, yeah, like, I'm like, okay, yeah, nice to meet you. From a metaphorical perspective, if any of these things are shaky in somebody's life, safety falls away really quickly for them. Mm-hmm. And so if we think about this idea of safe and loved, which we just talked about earlier, we pulled them out of the pillars because we think it's the foundation, right? It's the number one building blocks of relationship, and helping people feel supported. So thinking about that, right? We want to create a space and an environment we've talked about where people feel safe and they feel valued. If you don't have that, you've got nothing to work with. But these other 4 blocks are a way to get there. And we're going to relate those also back to the 5 tools. So the next 2 blocks are positive interactions and demands. And if we start to think about positive interactions and demands, what we know, the research actually tells us that we actually need 10 positive interactions for every demand placed on us. It sounds like a lot, doesn't it? There's a book that came out shortly after we started talking about this that said you could even get to 3 to 1, but I often think, can we get to 5 to 1? And 5 to 1, it turns out, is really easy. Because if you think about the 5 tools, if you use every one of your tools in every interaction in a positive way as perceived by the person at the other end or the other side of the relationship, you already have 5 positive interactions, right? So if you fully engage all 5 of those tools, and chances are, like things like words, right? You can actually have more than that because you can uplift the person, you can give them a compliment, you can ask them a question, you can listen to them, and so now all of a sudden you're at 10 pretty quickly, right? And so the psychology seemed weird, like 10 positive interactions for every demand. The trick is that what we know is that when there are too many demands compared to positive interactions, people no longer feel safe. And so it's a really easy relationship for us. And, you know, I didn't teach Jen that. That's just inherently who she is, right? It is a skill you can get better at, though. And she's being more intentional about it these days for the reason that she recognizes the value that it brings to the relationship. And, you know, I worked with my friend Kim, and then we have a colleague, my friend Shelley, who started in the company of others, the consulting company we run together. We started that. They're both masters at it, right? They're always able, it doesn't matter where we are, cashier, waitress, gas station attendant, person that we just meet in casual meeting, she's always got something positive to say about them, right? And in fact, we've often tag teamed on people who, like I remember a time we were in Victoria and we went to buy a dolly. We just started a series of 6 trainings around the province. And the first one was in Victoria, and we had all these bins, and we were all super organized. And then we got to the place, and we were like, we had to walk forever from where we parked our car to bring everything in. I'm like, let's go get a little dolly. Like, let's just go to a little hand truck. So we went to it, and we went to the Home Depot. And the young woman who was checking us out, you knew she had a shit day. Like, there was no question that it was a bad day for her. And I could just see Shelley, right? She's like, okay, like, let's see what we can do here, right? Like, and she is just like super charming, asking her how she was doing, right? How beautiful it was outside, right? Almost the end. And then and you could see it was falling flat. Like, this woman was having nothing to do with it, right? And so then I tagged on, right? I'm like, all right, like, let's see if the two of us, if we pour enough positivity, can we shift this in this interaction, right? And it didn't work.
No,
It did not work. And so what we said was it must have been a really horrible day for her, right? She had a really, really tough day. And then as we were driving home, because we know, Shelley noticed I tagged on, and we recognized that we feel that's part of our obligation to the culture and to the community, is to try and do that, to make sure that people really feel supported, right?
yeah.
And so we were in the car and we're talking, and we decided amongst ourselves, like, we never know the impact that you're going to have, right? And perhaps that young woman got home and she started reflecting on the day and what was bad, and then she was like, and then there were these 2 customers who showed up who really tried to make me feel good, and they didn't do it, like, it didn't happen, right? Like, so we can tell ourselves our own story to try and understand what that looks like and what we want to do, but the truth is, it cost us nothing. to be positive and supportive of her. And whether I had an impact or not, at least I tried, and I know in some way, shape, or form I did, right? At the end of the day, we know that people respond to that and are able to accept it or bring it in at the time. And it just gave me more empathy towards her, right? So.
Might as well calm. She might as well start smiling after you.
Right, who knows, right? She might have been like,
You know,
oh man, I
they
was
were
kind of
trying.
mean to those people, right? Like,
Yeah.
right, who knows the story? But it was just one of those, like, it's a really great example of it doesn't cost us anything, but we did everything that we possibly could.
But that's awesome though, because anybody's natural instinct would to put up a defense with
Right, to be just snappy back at her or
Yeah,
whatever,
right?
Which
That
is,
would've been an
which
automatic
we've seen
defense.
happen in COVID, right? Like
Yeah.
people are just mean because they're just in a bad place and
Stressed
things
out.
aren't working and stressed out and not and who takes the brunt of it? The people on the
front line,
periphery
yeah.
who aren't in their family because they really want to choke their husband, not the waitress, right? Like at the end of the day. So
There's a book called Power of Vulnerability by
Brene Brown.
Brene Brown, yeah, and she alludes to what you're talking about with regards to the sensitivity of the demand versus the ask, and that sort of thing. And she refers to a jar of marbles,
Yep.
and how you just spend time just putting marbles in, because you never know, in some capacity you're going to have to reach in and take marbles out of that jar. So it's the same.
It's the same metaphor. There's another one, the bucket fillers and the bucket dippers, that lots of elementary schools have been utilizing to get kids to be kind to each other. So there's all these ways of thinking about it, and it's not, again, it's not rocket science. I think we do it naturally with each other. It's when we're feeling vulnerable and not centered, that's when we don't do it, and that's when we run into trouble. Right? Particularly in our relationships, right? If my bucket doesn't feel full enough, any demand can set me off, right? Like, really? You're asking me to like wash the dishes right now? Like I got to do that right now? Really? You can't go get that yourself? Really? Like, but we can be kind to each other. And so it's like, it's another way to reframe, like it's super important. I love Brene Brown's work. I think that everybody should read all of her books, but if you only read one book, just read Dare to Lead and follow through on what she's talking about, and you'll be a transformed human being. She's one of the great thinkers of our time, for sure. So you start to see how the tools and the pillars start to relate to our interactions every day with people. There are two other things that we think are vitally important in supporting people, and those are that people need structure in their lives, and that we have to recognize that transitions are often where difficulty shows up. So structure has to be individualized. We all have lots of ways of keeping track of our days and ways in which we're supposed to be doing things. You know, I had to kind of, even just this week, I had to let go of a lot of structure. I'd planned on doing a bunch of work for work, and then as things emerged, it was like there was no space to do it. And I often think I can do way more. And I'm also a person who pushes back against structure, so I've found lots of ways that support me to build structure in. That little red book that's down there, pink book that's down there, is something based on a bullet journal, which is really just a list of lists and a way to keep track of time, which I've found very helpful for me. But I get to decide. Structure also has to be flexible, and there's lots of ways to implement it for people, but it has to be based on what the individual wants to have happen. And there has to be enough flexibility in it so that when you go on an outing to the community and they decide that they don't want to go to the movies, but they want to go get a Coke, we might want to go get a Coke, right? And what are we going to structure in place? Because there are the important twos and important fours. I don't know if any of you have been, like some of you have been through essential lifestyles planning, like what's important to the person and what's important for the person. And often what's important for the person isn't important to them, right? I think it's different as we grow and learn about who we are, that the important twos become important for us. We recognize both of those things, but what's important to the person takes priority often. And how do we sandwich the important twos with the important fours, right? or vice versa. How do we use the important twos to sandwich the important fours? Like, okay, so we need to do the dishes. How about if we do the dishes and then we have dessert and then we'll get ready for bed or whatever it might be, right? And then the person's like, well, I don't want to do the dishes, and I'm like, okay, well, like, how about if we switch those up then? Like, how about if we have dessert now? And then we get the dishes done, right? So there are ways to create that flexibility, and then the person still says, I don't want to do the dishes, right? My response often is, especially when we're working in environments where it's written in a plan or it's an outcome that somebody needs to make, I'm often like, well, can you just come hang out in the kitchen with me? Because you know what? I hate doing the dishes too, but I'd like to have some company. I'll take care of it, and then you're building the positive interaction versus the demand, and you're actually building the relationship. And at the end of the day, the focus has to be the relationship. At the end of the day, if we focus on that and we let go of everything else, we can speak out to the powers that be and say, I'm focusing on something different right now. What's important right now is the relationship. This person isn't feeling safe and supported, and I'm going to work on that in a way that I can get to the place where they're more than willing to do that and many other things with me.
Common dislike could actually create that relationship.
Yes, exactly. Right. It's like, right. Right. Oh, you hate doing dishes too? All right, I'll come and hang out with you. Oh, you think you could put this away for me? Oh, look, like, and so then you get to say, in the scheme of things, you get to say, oh yeah, the person completed the task, right? Like, it's a stretch, but it also is recognizing the kind of engagement you're able to bring to people and with people. So
Conversation could be how much we dislike scrubbing.
yes, exactly. Like, this is the part I hate the most, right? It's the pots at the end of the day. Like, could they not have soaked them after dinner? Like, really? Like, couldn't you put that away, right?
I was going to say, negotiating is a big thing, which you basically explained, right?
Yep.
It's like negotiating. Like you say, you take them to the movies, but they don't want to go to the movie. They want Coke first. But, sometimes, you gotta work through them, and, it's not about you. But I find a lot of negotiating, can really turn things around.
And I think letting go, right? In the negotiation, letting go of what's really important here, right? Of like, okay, we'll do this and maybe we can do that. And often if people are or feel like they're in relationship with us, it's not an issue, right? But if they don't, then we can let that go and we can just say, let's focus on engagement and relationship building. So just come hang out with me in the kitchen, right? Or whatever it might be. We can break it down even more, which is the thing I was going to talk about next, which is transitions, right? How do we move people from one thing to another? And how do we move them into something that isn't necessarily preferred for them to do?
And I find with all of these 6 elements, I find that it's good. But I also find that if you got to implement those 2 with the families, because if the family's not comfortable with you, it just makes your work life hard to support their children.
Yeah, our work is not just about the individual.
No,
our work is about building relationship with everybody,
families,
right?
Yeah.
We went to see someone last night, and the mom of the young man just texted. He had felt bad. He was upset because he felt like he had just vented to us, and he had, to some extent. It wasn't the only thing that happened in that, but he was feeling bad, and she was like, well, what did you talk about? Like, we were like, it was all good. We were fine with it, and we told him that before we left, and she's like, well, what did you talk about? And we were just over there deciding, and we said, well, you should probably talk to him about that. Because we did say, like, we don't have to share this with you. I mean, he got like down and dirty and said some things that I literally was like, I don't think you should be saying that, brother. Like, you gotta step that back a little bit. But she doesn't have to know that unless he wants to share it with her, right? That's not my job. My job is not to be the tattletale, particularly on the individual, right? And vice versa, right?
You risk safety in it.
Right, exactly. Yes. Then now I don't have a relationship anymore. I've broken trust, and he's never going to feel safe with me again, because no matter what I say, it's going to get back to my mom. Yep. And we reassured him that it was a conversation between us at the very beginning. And he was the one who kicked his mom off the phone at the beginning of the meeting. And his words were, oh, that relationship with my mom, it's just too dysfunctional right now. And I'm just like, whoa, like, really? You just said that? Okay.
It's hard for parents to let go, and sometimes the kids want a sense of, independence, a sense of
wanna live their life.
Yeah, and a lot of times goes back to SRV. It's like a lot of times the parents pity them. You know, half the time they pity them. Sometimes I think they underestimate their worth and their value and what they can do because, of what they're going through at the moment, right?
And I think that normally happens just as a parent to their children, period, regardless.
It's not even about disability, and we were talking about that a little bit earlier, right? And we said it to him, like, I want to know I want you to know at the end of the day, mothers love their children, whatever is going on, and that it's developmentally appropriate that you don't want to have anything to do with them right now. Like, that too is cool. I'm not going to get in between that. You guys got to sort that out for yourselves. I'm going to work with all of you and make sure that everything is going to be okay. But my role, and it is the complex role of when there are guardians and people in people's lives who can exert some kind of control, that we walk a really fine line. But my default, and I think it brings a lot of respect from families, is my default is, I just want you to know that I'm here for your child. I'm not here for you, I'm here for this person, and I'm probably going to speak out against some stuff that I think is happening, and I'm hoping that you can hear that I'm presenting it in the most loving and kinding and positive and supportive way that I can, but to know that at the end of the day, I have to side with them. Right? That's hard for people to hear. And there's lots of ways to negotiate that. And again, I think you guys are probably pretty expert in thinking about that and thinking it through. But these things are the things that are going to help, right? Like figuring out the positive interactions versus demands. What is the structure that's in place? And it can be just structure. Like, I'm not talking about that with you. You got to talk to your son about that, right? That's a simple boundary. And where those boundaries fall is not about keeping people in the dark. It's about recognizing my own role and who I'm here for in the moment.
And not creating more problems.
Not creating more problems. So the thing about transitions are that they're often where things start to get dicey. In any relationship, when we move, like we're here in this is a new relationship between us, that young man, and the parents, or really Jen. I mean, we're barely in the picture, but that the reality is that that's a transitional time in the relationship, right? People are building trust, so we have to make sure that everybody is feeling safe and supported, right? We've got to put in the positive interactions over the demands. No, that went really, really fine. Even though if mom heard some of the stuff he said, it wouldn't be fine, right? But it's fine for me, and I don't have to share that. So, but it's also big to small. Like this morning was a long transition, right? All of you helped us get everything set. You were late, so we had some space and time to, I mean, you weren't really that late. We weren't really waiting that long. We were setting stuff up and making things happen and so on. And that's, and the transition for you became a fraught one, right? Like, shit, I thought I was going to be able to be half in my pajamas at home, facing the screen, and y'all wouldn't know what was going on behind me, right? But now I have to get up and I have to come and I got to put my pants on and I got to put a little bit of makeup on and brush my hair better and get in the car and drive for 20 minutes and then I'm going to be there, right? That's a huge transition, right? And for us, when you walked in, it'd be like, that's okay, right? My point is like, we have to support the transition and recognize that they're difficult for all of us, right? Coming here, the transition of flying right now, like they show up in our lives all the time and they are hard. To move from one thing to another can be difficult. With support and structure, they become much easier, right? So knowing that I was going to be training at 9 o'clock this morning was great, right? The fact that it happened at 10, I got to have some flexibility in that, right? I got to recognize that there is a transition to all of those things happening. So it's just the thing to keep in the back of your mind. Is there a difficult transition going on? And then how can I use structure to break the transition down into smaller pieces? So there's this handout, Steps to Building Positive Relationships. This, I really, really like this thing, and it's kind of evolved over time. It was a couple of trainers on the west side of the state. We were developing we were revamping this thing called our 3-day practicum, and they built this in as a module to help people understand around relationship building, particularly around positive interactions and demands, like what are some of the things that we can do. And so Over time, it's evolved. It literally used to just be a stair step. It didn't have humility written in it. It was one of the things that emerged as we talked about it. On the back, there are just some examples. You don't necessarily need to worry about that at this point. And then as we trained it, I learned that each of these things was also connected to the 3 C's, right? That there was elements of it that were about connectedness, elements of it that were about companionship, and elements that were about community. And so if we start at the beginning of relationship, the most important thing is that people need to be seen, right? And so greetings are incredibly important. And we know from feedback, particularly around people who are supported, that often staff people will just walk in the house and not even say hello, right? And so we started to learn that greetings were really critical for people. We need to at least say hello, to acknowledge them. And in fact, that's the beginning of connection, right? Just saying hi. Making eye contact and saying hi with people. We've been doing walking over in the gorge the last couple of days. I always say hi to everybody. Even the fishermen who I'm sure are like, I'm trying to catch trout, you need to be quiet. I'm like, hey, right? I can't help it. It's who I am, right? That's how I am. But it's a really critical piece, right? People want to be seen. They need to be seen. That's the beginning of connectedness. Another way to easily get connected to people is this idea of compliments, right? Noticing something about them, usually physically, that we can make comment on. Again, I told you I'm a textile designer by training, and I'm a print designer. I was actually taught to take a blank piece of cloth and put some kind of an image on it. So I always notice prints and I always notice textiles. And so if somebody's wearing something that I think looks great, I tell them, right? And it doesn't matter who it is. And I tend to notice those things about people, right? Like, so some beautiful woman or guy walking down the street, and it's happened in both instances, this guy dressed to the nines in this incredible suit. You can tell he's proud of what he's wearing. Or this woman in a really beautiful sweet print dress, particularly when we were working in Australia. Dresses are huge because it's always warm there. And there's like every color, every pattern. So I'm constantly, I'd be like, that's a really great dress, right? And I do it to people that I don't even know all the time now. Because again, it's connection, right? But it's also noticing somebody and letting them know that they've been seen, right? And often when people dress really well, we know that they care about it. So we're also tying into something that they want to be seen and acknowledged for, right? This next piece, this small talk piece, is like a bridge between connectedness and companionship. It seems we do it so casually, but we don't recognize its value. The next thing is affirmations, right? And we think about companionship. Once we get to know people in a meaningful way, we start to recognize the qualities of who they are as a person. So affirmations in some ways are a compliment, but they're noticing something more deeply about a person, right? Jen always being kind when she's talking about her staff people, right? That's a really amazing thing, right? She's always kind in general. That's her modus operandi, right? I really appreciate that about her. And to be able to say that about her, right? Like I did today in this training, right? That we can find ways to tell people that they're good and we've noticed them in a deeper way that helps to deepen connection with them. This next one, humility, showed up as I was talking about the steps to building relationship, because I actually think it's one of the ways to deepen connection really quickly, is that we often screw up in relationships, right? We get it wrong, we say the wrong thing, we do the wrong thing, and we often dig in our heels, right? Like, oh, I didn't mean, like, right? Either we are really hard on ourselves or we're really hard on the other person, right? The thing that I know to be true is that when we show up with those people and apologize and own what happened between us, that relationship deepens. It's often reciprocal, right? It'll come back to us, but we often do it without that expectation. It's the vulnerability thing you were talking about that Brene Brown talks about. How do I be vulnerable enough to own what I did so that I can at least repair the relationship from my end? Whether that comes back to me or not is not the point, but humility and being humble with each other really shifts and changes things for the relationship. And I think in a much more meaningful and deeper way. This last next one, empathy, I think is the bridge actually to community, because empathy shows up in lots of ways in the ways that we interact with each other, right? We know about empathy, and Brene Brown talks about it. It's something that we teach our kids, right? From empathy comes compassion. And if we think about those two things together, and just for the record, I've never talked about it like this, but I think that empathy and compassion are also something that allow us to be connected to something greater than ourselves. So driving past a car accident, right? Our heart goes out to all of those people automatically. It's just a part of our nature. The Black Lives Matter movement being something that people are now showing up for and saying, like, I see this, I see you, I don't know what I can do, but I want to do something, and I acknowledge that I have a part to play in that, right? That's empathy and compassion showing up, and wanting to make some meaningful change in it as a result of that. So we're bridging into this idea of community, and I think the other one that helps to build community is the good gossip piece, because gossip is often looked at as a negative thing. We often talk smack about people, right? Oh, you hear about Frank and his wife, and blah, 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 right? Like, as opposed to like, did you hear about Frank? Like, he's such a great guy. I can't believe that the two of them are struggling, right? Like, there's a different way to do that. And good gossip is also the talking about Jen in front of Jen to all of you, right? I'm letting you all know that I see it, and I know you see it, and she gets to hear it. So, and sometimes good gossip can be a twofer. We can deepen more than one relationship in showing up for people like that.
Talking good about her.
Right,
So
and
it's natural
exactly.
instinct to talk good about somebody in front of them and behind their back.
Yep. Yeah, we can do it. And we can be intentional about it too. We can make sure that we point it out for each other so that if people are missing it, they get a chance to see it and acknowledge it as well. So it's really a simple thing. I like to think about it often in relationships, again, that I'm struggling with. Like, where am I? What do I need to do, right? And often where it shows up is humility, right? Like, if we're struggling, like, I haven't been humble enough, I've been digging in my heels, I haven't been doing that. I was really struggling with, I have a staff person who's the director of advocacy, really smart woman, has worked in education for a long time, and most of the work that we do is in educational advocacy, and she is amazing at it, and it is a big part of our work, but my dream is that we do way more adult advocacy, because that's what the organization was built on. I don't know if I told you guys, I'm the executive director of a local ARC called the ARC Community Advocates in Kalamazoo that I just started in January. You're looking at somebody who would have been living in poverty and have like drained his retirement up right about now if I had not gotten that job, right? And this has been helpful to be able to come and do this again, because it's really invigorated that. But she's somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience in adult advocacy and is kind of struggling with it. And I just keep trying to reassure her, like, I need you to take care of the thing that you've got down pat. I really need you to do that, because I don't have any experience in it. I don't understand the ins and outs of it. It's actually way more legal and way less creative than the work that I want to be able to do with adults. But it's important work too. And families need that kind of support, and so do those kids. So at the end of the day, and I think it's kind of clicked in, like, I'm like, you do not have to take care of this other part. And in fact, you don't even need to know anything about it. Just come along for the ride.
Is she overthinking it?
Yes. Of course she is. Of course she is, right? Because it doesn't fit with the ways in which she's operated with it.
It doesn't have to be that complicated.
No, but she's worked in the system for so long, it's hard for, and she's a trained social worker, and she's older than me. So she's like, her mindset is different than mine, and I can really appreciate that. It's really stretched me to think about it. And she's a personality that I wouldn't necessarily be drawn to, right? As a person who would want to be in relationship with somebody. It's not necessarily somebody that I would have a deep, meaningful relationship with. But at the same time, she's someone who is older than me, isn't working in the environment she worked. She was unemployed in consulting for a number of years, got this job about 3 years ago, is really good at it and likes it. And her mindset actually helps me to think differently about the work too. And so I start to look, where is the gift in this, right? Where does this show up? But it's not been easy at times, right? It's just like,
And that's what challenges us.
Right. Well, because as soon as I start to feel that way, I start to look at these things like, how am I not serving the central purpose? How am I not nurturing her? How am I not creating the space for her to feel safe? Where am I in these steps to building a relationship? How do I just let it go and continue to do what I know to be right and to have her come on board? Like to just keep telling her she's amazing. Because it's
a crazy dichotomy because you have to be outside of yourself and be inside of yourself at the same time. And ultimately it's, when I'm looking at these things right here, a lot of these things are outside things that you have to do to and for others.
Yep.
But you need the humility and the empathy within yourself to continue to get to that.
That's a really nice way to think about it. I like that. Thank you.
You know, I'm going to use this for my daughter. She has an anxiety with regards to meeting people, and she always looks at the end result of where she wants to be at with having these best friends and having these dates and going on vacations with these people that she's never really had a conversation with. So my thing is like there's steps that you have to get to in order to get there, and I think that this is perfect. Right here.
And it goes back to the 6 elements, right? There's some structure for you. And she's in transition. Like these are all the transitions.
Yeah.
The structure here's, you want to transition from meeting a person to being their best friend.
Yeah.
There's all these things that have to happen in between before that happens.
She's 16.
Okay.
She's 16.
That's a tough
Yeah, and
age
it's that
to
high
be
school
at.
thing, and you know, it's a lot of social anxiety. So, and she wants those connections.
Yeah.
So it's really trying to make her understand that she's good enough to be able to acquire friends, and that she has a lot of positive attributes that she can bring to friendships. But then there's an art to going about establishing friendships, and it's not just a cut and dry thing. There's a whole bunch of different variables that happens at the same time, and you have to be able to negotiate those.
And there's layers and levels of friendship.
Yeah.
Right? You don't find your best friend the first time around, right? But you have a lot of friends that led up to the best friend, right? You learned a lot of skills along the way, right? To be able to support her in that way is also pretty awesome.
Because not everybody that come into your life means you well, right?
Yeah.
Or that you want to be friends with, but you don't know that until you know them.
And then it takes longer to find out if you really want that person to be your best friend. And then
You don't mold with everyone.
no, it's a hard thing.
Yeah,
It's
it is.
hard.
It's difficult, and
Yeah.
I feel for the difficulties that she's going through. But I think that what I told her just as early as last Sunday, I said, but you'll find yourself on the other side of it. You know, once you figure out how to negotiate that, once you get over your fears and your anxieties, once you deal with those things and you come out on the other side of it, you'll be a more whole Jada as a result of doing that. So.
Well, and to think about all of that in light of COVID and all the other things that we don't have access to that really help us, like spending time together, right? Being alone together, just the two of you somewhere, to have the conversations where you can be vulnerable, cry on somebody's shoulder, be mad, right? Have the back porch conversation about how shitty your dad is, right? Right? All those things contribute. So
Definitely.
I think that's all I have. There is one more handout in there, and I don't know that we necessarily need to go over it, but because I don't think you guys are going to necessarily be dealing with people who are really challenging. But there is a, well, yeah.
She's like, hello.
We could have a separate conversation, Jen. Let me just draw a little circle here too. We can talk. I'll talk about it for a minute. We got a minute, so what?
How many do you have? How many rooms do you have?
3.
Is this their like masculine thing that they're doing, or are they just trying to?
Yeah.
So, challenging interactions are so obviously we utilize this when we were helping support people who were incredibly, usually physically challenging and aggressive to themselves or other people. And we utilize this worksheet as a way for people to start to think about how do I need to be responding to a particular action? And so we decided to divide those up into aggressive and non-aggressive and distracting behaviors, right? And so we talked about these idea of aggressive behaviors where basically the person is a danger to themselves or to somebody else, require a very immediate response. We have to do things to keep everybody safe, right? That's the number one. And the aggressive, this one, the definition here actually says a real threat to oneself, others, or property. And I always say I don't think property should be in that. People can destroy whatever they want, so long as they're not throwing it at me or somebody else and going to hurt them with it. You can break your TV. It's your TV. It's not mine, right? Even though I work here, and even though it's a group home and other people are going to be impacted, at the end of the day, it's still your TV. And then non-aggressive are those things that people do to distance us from them. And so, you know, it's not biting, hitting, scratching, but it's things like swearing, yelling, lying, stealing, all of those things. And the one thing that I always, in that training, always talk about is like that, asking people whether they think spitting is aggressive or non-aggressive behavior.
It's the distancing.
It's a distancing behavior, right? But people react to it like it's aggressive, right? And they step into it to respond immediately, when really what the person's trying to do is push you away. And it's really interesting because there are always people who are just like, well, it's aggressive because like, what if I got a disease from them? Like we're talking, I'm like, do you know what the risks are if that person's saliva actually hits any other mucous membrane of you for you actually getting something from them is infinitesimal, right? And so, but it's a good distinction, right? Like this is the thing. We don't step into that, we step away. How do you not get spit on? You step back. Like, it's not really like at the end of the day, right? And then the distracting behaviors, and some of those I often talk about from the autism perspective, right? There are some what we think of as distracting behaviors are actually calming behaviors for people. Yeah. And then others that don't allow them to focus on the task and our job. So our job is different for each of these. We want people to be engaged here. Mm-hmm. We want to let people know we're here for them regardless of what they're doing when it's non-aggressive. And when it's aggressive, we're going to keep them safe. Yep. Talking about the causes, right? I haven't had a chance. It's been a number of years. I keep saying I'm going to make a new graphic that literally says that any one of these shows up for the person internally can manifest itself in any way externally. So I tell people, like, you got to think about, like, if first off, the first thing to do when behavior shows up, and what you just said, right, is it was actually something physical, right? It was medication that had an impact, and it came out as anger towards you, right, in that moment, right? Mm-hmm. But that fear can lead to anger can lead to fear, but often fear and frustration can manifest in ways that aren't healthy for people. But our job is to get to the bottom of it, which is what I think your example was really good. And then these other strategies I think are helpful because they focus on those two elements of positive interactions and demands, right? Often what we want to do, it used to say in the middle here, it used to say hang in there, and I've decided that was way too desperate. Like, okay, here I am, right? But what you really mean is to stay the course, right? Like to keep moving through the interaction to see if you can get through to the other side. But then the other things that we can do are really to improve the interaction in some way, whether it be abandon the task and focus on the person, change expectations, validate feelings, change our own energy level, or modify our tone, right? All of the tools, now we start to think about using them differently. If I'm super upbeat and that's not working, let's slow things down. If it's too slow, let's pick things up. Yeah, and validating people's feelings, right? I'm really sorry that you're feeling this way right now. What can I do to help? Right, being able to offer. So we're not focusing on getting the task done. We want to improve the interaction. And then the other side of that is that often people are feeling demanded upon. That's the thing that brings aggression or behavior. So how do we change the pace? How do we modify the environment? Maybe it's too bright. Maybe we calm things down. Maybe we brighten things up. What kind of prompts are we giving people? Are we giving too many? Do we need to break that down? So you start to look at structure. Is it the transition that's the difficulty? What are they focusing on? What can I do to help improve that? Taking a little break in between. And at the end of the day, just abandoning the task, right? Like, okay, we don't really have to do this right now. Because if the choice is between somebody freaking out and us just giving in, let's give in at the end of the day, right? And I think this could be helpful as we think about some of that. And Jen, I feel like we talked a little bit about that to Dan right? And he's already getting some of that in the person that he's working with, right? What looks like aggressive behavior is really just communication of his frustration, and that he's not doing anything at this point to hurt anybody else, including himself. And so we just have to try and stay the course and modify things along the way. We're looking at the fact that it's probably physical and we need to deal with some other things, but at the end of the day, he's still keeping himself and people around him safe. It's a great little reference again, like what could I do when I'm struggling, right? And I use this, I used it with the person I was talking about, right? This is just behavior. They're not feeling safe. What am I going to do to help her feel safe? So when I was a caregiver, both times that I was a caregiver in the US, it was taught as a blanket thing. Everybody got taught. We were taught MANT, so everybody was taught MANT. So you spend a whole day talking about relationships and what you can do to de-escalate things, and then you spend another whole day on figuring out how to hold people down and keep control of them. When I started to work at the center, Macomb-Oakland Regional's perspective was that we didn't teach people physical management because what happens often is that people resort to that as the first response as opposed to the last response. So we only taught it when we knew people were at risk of needing to use it. So it's interesting though, because there's a friend of mine, John Windsor, who now works for MANT. He was a trainer in Kalamazoo, went through general teaching, totally believed in all of the culture of gentleness work that we did. And he really believed that the front end of MANT and culture of gentleness tied in perfectly. And he weaves that in even when he's teaching it. And he now trains trainers and then recognizes that there is still some importance for that, right? And the MORC and the Center for Positive Living supports. I was just talking to my friend Kim, who's the director there, and they are now being asked to train it in-house as opposed to sending people out to outsource that. So there's a number of trainers who are now learning it so that they can teach it when they need to. But I often think that we don't need to train it unless people are really a physical danger and harm to themselves and others on a consistent basis. That it doesn't. I mean, I've had some experience. So I worked in Chicago for about 6 months trying to help a young man move out of an institution. He was on the spectrum, my friend Joe, and at that time they were working at deinstitutionalizing Illinois, and he was a high flyer, but had 2 lawyers for parents and got into the law advocacy, and they figured out a way and found a provider who was willing to risk trying to figure out how to do this. He was a 3-on-1 support and actually sometimes 4-on-1. And I worked, that's a lot, is a lot of people. The problem was that, and I was a consultant, so I was sometimes that 4th person in the home. And I think within the first 2 weeks that he was there, even though I'd done training with staff on culture of gentleness and how to intervene and so on and so forth, he tried to elope, and the staff people chased him down the street, got him on the boulevard, and broke his arm while they were restraining him. And so he was the first case that I worked with in a long time that I really got beat up, like literally, and put myself in between him and people that he was going after, because again, like, I think we have a responsibility to keep people safe, and as a supervisor or a consultant, I have a responsibility to keep everybody safe. So I'm going to put myself in harm's way, and that's often what we need to do. We need to put ourselves in harm's way, and so did, and got pretty beat up to the point that I actually had some trauma as a result of it. Fortunately, I know myself well enough, and every time Joe would start to escalate after that particular incident, I could feel it. I could just be like, oh, what's gonna come? And I'm like, all the fear, everything, all the anxiety would show up. And And there were a number of people there who got beat up over time, right? It wasn't just me. I fortunately know some really good people. I knew somebody who worked with trauma. She focuses on immigrants immigrants who have been traumatized by violence in their lives, and she uses EMDR, and I had a feeling that it was going to be the right thing. Eye movement reprocessing, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's actually a PTSD. It's actually clinically proven to help people reduce their PTSD. And I knew that she did it, and so I called her up and I just said, hey Jean, I've had this incident, I'm not exactly sure, but would you be able to see me? And so she took me, within a day, or 2 days, I saw her over her lunch break and talked to her about the situation and what had happened, and she's like, and I was thinking I wanted her to do EMDR, but I didn't tell her that, but she was like, so do you want to try some EMDR to see whether that would help? And went through that process and literally watched that trauma leave my body, or felt that trauma leave my body through that process. And it made a huge difference, but it also really helped me to realize that I needed to be there for all of the people that were getting beat up as a result of it. We actually ended up mostly using 911 as our way for police to come in, because he often would de-escalate when the police showed up.
Oh, interesting.
And then ended up hospitalized for a couple of hours, and then he'd be able to come home, because everything, which is really common, like all the things that were happening for him were really common. And what was amazing about that was that after having gone through it so immediately, that I could actually help people process their trauma and get them to stay engaged as staff people, even over a phone conversation. Because most of it is about listening to their own trauma and letting them talk it through. Because every single one of those people there really cared about Joe, because he was really a great guy, right? It was often sensory overload for him in some way, shape, or form, and it just came out as aggression. Right? And we worked with Jen, right? I did some work with you and Kyle. It's not easy work, but so incredibly valuable, and it's a really great skill to have, which is why I share this with people, because then you can at least think about what you want to do to make it different.
It's funny, and it's nice the supervisor can put themselves in, because we were taught CPI on a regular basis.
Yep.
CPI training, I'm just dying for the day to end. It take a lot of energy out of me. It's like you're teaching me to be the next Karate Kid.
Right. Yeah.
But I never had to use it. But I know this one individual I work with, she has self-injurious behaviors, and a lot of the restraining we had to do was arm compression, because that was just basically helping her to avoid her from hitting her eyes up. My supervisor, she was having a little episode one day. Her hands was flying and she was screaming. I don't know what triggered the behavior, but she was hitting herself. And then my supervisor, he went over and stood over her when she's having her episode. She's speaking. So he went and stood over her. She's going poof, right in between.
Won't do that again.
I was like, why would you do that? You never stand
Over
over an
someone.
individual in that manner. And she kicked him where he didn't want to be kicked. He's like, ouch.
Yeah, that wasn't a smart decision.
No. So he quickly learned his lesson.
It was quick.
No. It was like, no.
Any other questions from you guys? Thoughts?
No.
Was it helpful?
Very.
That's the part I like to hear. It usually is, right? And again, I'll just reiterate, I don't think I taught you anything. I think you all know this inherently. All I gave you was language to be able to talk about it amongst yourselves and with each other and the people around you. Jen obviously has my contact information. If you want to talk about anything at any point in time, whatever that might be, know that will make myself available. I don't always answer my phone or text messages immediately, but just know that I'll get back to you for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. And it's 1 o'clock.
It was very
One-on-one.
insightful.
Yeah.